Stephen, thank you very much for joining me today and welcome to the podcast. First things first is I want to get to know a bit about yourself and where it all started. So I'm very aware of your journey, starting out in Germany and then later going back to the UK to plant vines. But what was your first memorable experience of wine and what made you interested in the world of wine?
It started at before Germany. It's actually 50 years ago, very much about this time. We were looking for a house. My son was born in October of this year. 50 years ago. And we were looking for a house, and we found one which had a little vineyard attached outside Maidstone in a village called Nettlestead. We didn't buy the house, but obviously I was interested in this vineyard. Got back to our house where we lived, and I must have looked in the Yellow Pages or somewhere, found there was an English Vineyards Association, joined it, found out a bit more about it, and to cut a long story short, my father-in-law, who I was working for at the time, who was a farmer, and he had a house building business as well. He said, "Well, if you want to do this," he said, "I'll help you with the farm, and you find out how to do it and get on with it." So that's really what happened. I'd met my wife in Austria. She was English, but we'd met out there skiing, and we bought. We decided. You're ready to do this, I take it, aren't you? Yeah. So we went out to Germany to look for a job for me. I found one, and I spent almost 2 years out there working, studying at Geisenheim, and then we came back in 76 and planted in 77.
So that was your induction into the world of viticulture and winemaking in Geisenheim. And then when you came back, that's when you planted the site at Tenterden, which is now home to Chapeldown in the sense.
Indeed, yes. We planted in Easter Monday, 1977, 5,500 vines, which was considered quite a lot in those days. And over the years, we expanded it, and we did quite well in terms of wine. We won prize for the best wine of the year, Gall-Brown Trophy in year 2, which was very nice. Sunday Times rang up and said, "We'd like to come and do a story about you." He said, "We're going to send our new wine reporter, Jancis Robinson, down to see you." So this is pre-MW, and she's about my age. And we met at Ashford Railway Station, no mobiles in those days, and she came along to our house, and we had a wine tasting and a tour, and she wrote a very nice piece in the Sunday Times, 3 pages.
Nice, your first introduction.
Really got us off the ground. A lot of people then saw it, obviously, and we started selling our wines quite well.
And what wines were you producing and selling?
Well, we had 4 varieties. We had Müller-Thurgau and Seyval Blanc, which were the 2 sort of workhorses of the industry at the time. Reichersteiner, which was number 3. And then a variety called Guttenborner, which only one other grower grew, Carl Taylor, as it happened. And I think he's still got it. But those are the 4 varieties we planted. I planted a whole selection of other varieties in sort of 25 vine lots. But those are the 4 major varieties. So we made blends, we made single varietals, we made a Seyval Blanc in a single varietal, Guttenborner, Müller blend in like dry, medium dry, off dry, you could make 5 or 6 wines out of it. We didn't have any red varieties. No, we used to make 3 or 4 wines a year. And they did very well. And we were selling them at really the prize-winning wine was at $3.75, and we went up to $4.75. And I worked out the other day, it's about £25 a bottle in today's money. And of course, tax was a lot lower, and VAT was 8%. So, we felt we were on a roll. And then we sold the business after 10 years for all kinds of reasons, mainly because we were running out of money, to be honest. My father-in-law had bought the farm and supplied us with enough working capital. But, we were on our own by that time, and, it didn't look as sort of promising as obviously it does today. And I had I wanted to start writing, and so that really sort of took over half my life. So I did writing, I did consultancy, and I did winemaking. So I was contract winemaking really all the way through until 2000, when I stopped because Chapeldown got sold again, or the business got, the winery got sold. And everything was a little bit up in the air.
And after that first experience with that first planting, you went on to become general manager at Lamberhurst.
Yes, Lamberhurst was by far away the biggest. It was a sort of a 600, 700, 800 ton winery. So it's equivalent of some quite large wineries today. Obviously not as large as Chapeldown or Nye Timber, but certainly the equivalent of, say, Hattingley. The then German winemaker, he, for all kinds of reasons, went back home. And the owner, Kenneth McAlpine, rang me up, or his secretary rang me up, and said, would you like to come and have a word with me? And that's what happened. I was there for 3 years because he wanted to sell it. That was the first thing I discovered. Really, he wanted someone like myself to sort of hold on to it, keep it going, and then he'd prepare it for sale, in effect.
And what made you, a few years later, start thinking about writing and contributing articles to the likes of these big magazines?
Well, in '86, having sold the Vineyard, I bought two things. I bought a car, not second-hand car, nice Mercedes, but I also bought an Amstrad word processor, £399. Came in a box. It had twin disk drives, 127K each disk drive, I remember, something like that. It had a screen, it had a printer, it had a keyboard. And I just got really sucked into the writing side. I've always done a bit of writing. English was one of my favourite subjects. But I could see that if I could combine writing and winemaking and a bit of consultancy, I could see there was a living to be made, which is what I did for quite a few years.
And have you enjoyed being able to dip your feet into many different facets of the world of wine, writing, viticulture, winemaking, wine tasting?
Well, yes, I soon discovered that wine writing is quite difficult to make a living out of. You think, oh well, getting the job is the first thing, writing it is the second thing, and getting paid is the third thing. Actually, getting paid is the most difficult part of all that. Getting the job, if you're going to do it for nothing, is fine. But no, I enjoyed it. There was no travelling, there was no sort of expenses for travelling, but I didn't hang around. I got quite a few articles published. I was quite pleased. But then I decided to write a book, the English and, what's it called? The Vineyards of England and Wales, or no, the Vineyards of England. And I self-published that in '89. 4,000 books or 5,000 books I had printed. I eventually sold them all. Quite a lot of posting and going to the post office and putting stamps on envelopes. So I thought that was, was okay. It came out, it washed its face, as they say. Covered my expenses. And then I wrote one of the Faber books, Classic Wine Libraries. It's still called that, but and that did quite well. That won a prize for the best wine book of the year, André Simon Wine Book of the Year, which was nice. And I enjoyed the writing. And since then, I've developed that. I've done a master's in creative writing at the University of East Anglia, and written, I don't know, 9-10 books now, and always updating my sort of current books, which are really like sort of classroom books, for the wine industry, for WCT and for MW, plus wine growing in Great Britain, which I think has been remarkably successful, given that it's a sort of £35-40 book, but everyone buys one, so that's good, and that's due for an update in a couple of years' time.
I see. And in 2000, I think you alluded to a few minutes ago, you went to Brunel University to do a bachelor degree. Was that a bit of a break from the world of wine?
Well, yes. It was in between my sort of getting a divorce in '96 and sort of finding my feet in the world of wine again. And I just thought, well, I would, I like the writing. I've got, a bit of a creative mind and quite artistic in some ways. I'm technologically okay with computers and video. So I thought, well, I will do a multimedia degree, which I did. And but at that, because I had tried getting the Master of Wine, I failed the tasting 4 times in a row. I passed the written first go, which was good, but I hung on, and I got dispensation to do the degree, so I took a 3-year gap. And then, just as I was sort of thinking about what was I going to do with my life and with the degree and with my knowledge, a friend of mine said, would I like to come and help an investor create a retail and online wine shop, fine wine shop. And I got back into sort of wine and wine selling and wine tasting and buying. And I sort of thought, well, I'll give it another go at the MW. And the tasting came good and I got it. And so in '03, I passed.
You're very modest to say that you passed the writing portion of your exam when you awarded the Robert Mondavi Award. Well, yeah. Once you knew you had passed all portions of the exam, I gather. But it just speaks volumes as to your technical expertise and having done all that practical application in the years prior, as opposed to just academic study.
I think what clinched it was in those days, on the Friday, it was a 4-day exam. Friday morning, you had one paper, and they set you a really wacky question, 2 hours. The Secrets of Soil was mine. There were 3 or 4, but I like the idea of that. And I wrote with my red fountain pen, and I can see myself doing it now. I wrote 8 pages. I'd love to see the paper because God knows what I wrote, but it flowed. And I think somebody who the markers must have been quite impressed by that. But the Secrets of Soil, is when you have a vineyard, when you have any plant, you look at the plant, you see the leaves, the shoots, the flowers, the fruit, whatever. but you don't know what's happening down below, and that's what you're trying to find out.
And that's one of your areas of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, trying to work out what the soil is providing for your plant, what the soil is doing to your plant, what the roots are doing down there. That's what you're trying to decide when you look at a plant.
And you've since gone on, after the Masters of Wine, you're involved in several boards, you've done a lot of wine judging as well, and a lot of consultancy work across English vineyards. And since you've started your career in wine and also this consultancy work, how has the perception of English wine changed over time?
Well, I was in an arts club in Chelsea last night, and I was introduced to somebody. The first thing he said was, "Why is English wine so expensive?" That's not changed. That was the same in 1970 when I started. Some people consider that English wine is expensive. I looked at this guy's shoes and said, "I see you with some very nice shoes on." I said, "You can get them a lot cheaper than that at Primark." I'm not sure you can, but anyway. I said we all have our own, hobbies, as it were, and some people like handbags, and some people like wine, and some people like racehorses, but I said if it wasn't selling at that price, people would not sell it at that price. The other thing is that obviously English wine now has turned a huge corner because we're now using, what classically known as international varieties. So if a sommelier wants to describe an English sparkling wine, all they have to say is, well, it's made from Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and it tastes like champagne. Whereas, if you have a Müller-Thurgau, Reichersteiner, Seyval Blanc, Gutenborner blend, it gets a little bit more difficult. And if you have to say, well, it's like an Alsace wine or a German wine, that's really the kiss of death. No variety with an umlaut in it ever sold. is my Gewürztraminer, Müller-Thurgau, etc., etc.
Is that the preconception of the British audience hearing a German name and not being familiar or comfortable with trying the wine?
Well, German wine still has a bad rap from going back 60, 70 years, or going back till pre-war, I think, almost. It was always sweet and always, it never in the same class as English. As good French or Italian or other countries' wine. Even though, the Victorian era, the top German wines were more expensive than the top French wines. I knew the Seychelles family, whose main brand was Blue Nun in those days, multi-million case worldwide, wine. And they told me with some authority, because they had an office right by the Savoy, the top selling white wine on the Savoy's wine list in the 60s and 70s was Blue Nun.
I see.
Yeah.
And what has changed since then? Why is it that now English wine, particularly English sparkling wine, has become more on the map and people are more aware of it and are more willing to try it?
Well, I think because it's got the standard varieties that people know, because it's like a product that English still wine in the days when mostly Germanic varieties, the best you could say was it is like an Alsace wine, or maybe like a Rheingau Palatinate wine, and those two things don't really go down very well except with sort of specialist wine buyers. But to say, it's very much like a Chablis or Chardonnay, or Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand for Bacchus, it just reassures people that they're not drinking something weird and wonderful.
Sure.
Because when they're not, a lot of people are very shy about saying, "I don't really like this. Could we have something else?" But they should do it. But this is changing, and I think now still wine, we've turned a corner with that to some extent. There's a lot more people now making some quite adventurous wines. So a lot of small people under the railway arches around. There's about 5 or 6 wineries under the arches in London, making weird, wonderful selection of wines. But it gets the word out there, and there's a lot of interest in natural wines. Not that I'm interested in them, but there is a lot of interest in natural wines. Pet Nat, which some people are doing. So I think there is more interest in sort of alternative wines than perhaps there used to be, and there's some English people buying, some people in Britain buying in grapes from English Welsh vineyards, and making some quite unusual wines with them.
In conjunction with that as well, you've got a huge amount of growth in the vine area planted wine production too. And one of your focal points as a consultant is financial sustainability. And I think the English vineyard industry is still going through its growth phase. Why is it, do you think, that a lot of vineyards aren't profitable, and what are some potential solutions around that?
Well, I think it's wrong to say they're not profitable. It's very difficult to work out what is a profit. because most of your upfront capital is going on assets that are 25. We're going to be working for you without alteration for 25, 35, 40 years. So how do you cost that? Over what period do you write that off? It's quite difficult to have a set of accounts that takes account of that fact. When in business sense, you write them off probably as quickly as you can, for all the obvious reasons, taxation reasons. But in reality, once your vineyard is 5 years old, you've paid for it, and apart from annual upkeep, which is what you have to do, obviously. So it's quite difficult. And winery equipment, I saw the press that I bought in 1982 the other day, it's tucked in the corner of a winery, still there, still working, still able to do what it did. Had a couple of upgrades on the electrics, had a couple of new bags in it, but essentially, the 10,000 I paid in '82 is still there and still, it's probably worth 3 times that now.
Yeah.
So I think it is quite difficult to immediately say this is profitable, this is not profitable. What is certain, though, is that a lot of people have planted vineyards in sites which do not lend themselves to sustainable yields, and I think that's a problem. I see it time and time again. Just yesterday I received 2 brochures about vineyards for sale, which thankfully actually had the sort of annual yields in them as part of the brochure, which I thought was a bit adventurous. Neither of which I would recommend anybody bought them on, because the yields are pretty low. And yield, if you're running a vineyard, you've got £3,500–4,000 pounds expenditure per acre per year on running it, which has to be paid by your crop. You can look at the crop in 2 ways. Obviously, you can look at it in terms of value of grapes, which have a market value, which varies a little bit, but you're talking about £1,500 to £2,000. So you need 2 tons per acre to cover the annual running costs. If you're not getting that, you're out of pocket on that side. Obviously, if you're making wine, storing it, and selling it, the financial equation is very different. But it's still, a third of your turnover, probably, if you're selling wine, especially through the trade, to restaurants, hotels, on-trade, off-trade, shops, retail, supermarkets, and so forth, you're only actually getting a third of your turnover, because the rest goes in tax and duty and expenses. So it's a tough world out there, and I would never recommend anybody relies on selling all their output to high-end restaurants and hotels. I hear that so often. Oh, where are you going to sell all this? Well, high-end restaurants and hotels. Dream on. It doesn't work like that.
And it depends on the size of the vineyard too. If you're a small sort of 5-acre plot, that might be more direct. If it's
if you're direct, yeah. And the most, one could say the most successful vineyards, and it's obviously quite difficult to define success. But the most high-profile vineyards, and the ones that appear most often in the trade, the press, and prize giving, and what have you, are those where they have a direct contact with the customer. Selling. Chapel Down probably sells 70,000–80,000 bottles a year direct from their site in Tenterden. Camel Valley, they sell 3/4 of their output from home. So those, and if you go around and look at all the big vineyards these days, they've all got great hospitality. Yeah, pretty much. Not all. Knight Timber doesn't, but they're a slightly a unique proposition. But certainly the Hattingleys, the Gusbournes, the Chapel Downs. They've all got great on-site facilities for entertaining and for selling.
Yeah, and another big key theme there, Bolney came to mind, reminded me of the Freischnitt acquisition last year, is we're seeing a phenomenal amount of overseas interest. And first of all, I think you were involved in the sort of Champagne alliance, so to speak, of the likes of Pommery and Taittinger establishing plots in the UK. Yeah. And now we've seen the likes more recently of Jackson Family Wines establishing themselves in the UK wine industry. What do you make of this overseas interest?
Well, I think a lot of wine companies have vineyards around the world. I don't think it's, the big ones all certainly do. Moët Hennessy and Pernod Ricard, they've got vineyards in all the major wine producing regions. So I don't think it's that unusual. I think the proximity of France obviously makes, Champagne interest in the UK started way before Pommery and Taittinger. Duval-Loire came looking a long while ago. I planted Whiston and Squerries, I think in about 2004-05, I think it was. They had both been targeted by Duval. For all kinds of reasons, they didn't plant. And then there was Birkar Salmon. They were interested to do a joint venture with Berry Brothers. That didn't happen because of the '08 crisis. There were various people sort of came looking, and I've got involved with a few over the time, Italians and Norwegians and Americans. In Jackson Family, I was helping them about 5 or 6 years ago. They liked what they saw. They wanted to buy Gusbourne. That wasn't for sale, even though I thought it might have been. So they were looking at various options, and Barbara said to me that she'd got a lot of things happening. They were, cash-wise, they were already fully committed in various areas, buying in the States and in Italy. I believe they bought a vineyard, but they would be back, she said, because we're here for the horses, because they like, or her daughter likes breeding horses, so they were very interested in that side of things. And I think they felt they had a natural affinity to the UK, and they wanted to get involved. They liked the product, and they liked the growing conditions, and they weren't frightened of taking a risk. The Taittinger thing, and that was really from Patrick McGrath at Hatch Mansfield. It wasn't Taittinger came looking. It was Patrick McGrath who said that as Hatch Mansfield, which he's a part owner of, is a profitable company, we feel we should be involved with the English sparkling wine. We'd like to. What are the chances of buying an existing one, or buying in grapes? And I said, well, there's the third option, which is buying land and planting. And so we chatted about that, and then Patrick said, well, we'd have to involve Taittinger, because that's our deal, that we have their agency, but we don't have a competitor to them. We're not allowed to, as it were. And so I said, well, that sounds fine to me. And so initially it was going to be a 30%, 60, 70% split, with 30% Taittinger putting in 30%. But it took quite a long time to persuade the board of Taittinger that this was going to be a profitable. There was a lot of spreadsheets were done, with a lot of prices changed up and down, and a lot of costs changed up and down, and yields. And we eventually got one that they accepted. But they said, we're only going to do it if we have 51%. So we said, fine, you put 51% of the money in, it's yours. We didn't say fine, but that was the deal. And so that's how it came about. So Hatch had an English sparkling wine to sell. That's why we're not going to have much retail, if any, in the new winery. There'll be a visitor room, but it won't really be set up for sales. We won't be doing mum and pop tours, as it were. And that's going to expand. We're looking for more land. We've got more land to plant next year. Land around the winery, which is now, well, not finished, but it's now where it is. It's not going to move. So we know which land we got to plant up around the winery, and we've got another plot. I'm not quite sure whether we've signed on it yet, but it's going to happen soon. Pommery, I wasn't involved with Pommery, so I don't know their how all that happened. I know how they bought the land, but I know what they paid for it. But and I think they're a slightly unusual champagne house, I believe. The Vranken is a Belgian, as I understand it. I don't know the guy at all, but they're doing their own thing with Hattingley. But our winery is going to be fantastic, really nice.
It'll be an exciting project to see, and it's interesting you mentioned Jackson Family Wines considering the likes of investing in Gusbourne, given that CEO Charlie Holland will be moving to Jackson Family Wines.
Well, that's interesting.
In September.
Well, there was the link made there. Yeah.
Yes, and it leads me to my question of what role do you think, if any, consolidation will play in the English wine industry going forward?
I don't think it's as much as many people think. Most of the successful vineyards, and again we have to use that word successful carefully, most of the high-profile vineyards are well-funded by individuals, by groups, by investors, and I don't think that many of them are looking to sell out. And I know most of them. There will be some, obviously. You've got 2 PLCs. You've got Gusbourne, and you've got 3 actually: Hattingley, Gusbourne, and Chapeldown. So they are all owned by investors who probably would take a profit if they were offered it. So there is that aspect. Obviously, that's something which, as a PLC, you've got really, little control over what someone wants it, and they've got the money to pay for it, then it'll go. But the other private vineyards, I think succession will take its toll, as it were. Balfour is one of my, Hashheath Estate, as we used to call it, but Balfour Winery, The owner, Richard Balfour-Lynn, is 70 this year, I believe. You know, time takes its toll. He's built up a very nice business there. You know, he loves the place, but there comes a time when he has to decide whether he wants to carry on. I'm not sure about his children, whether they want to carry it on, but you know, running a winery is not for everybody. Camel Valley, you know, you've got Sam's children. I mean, that's a sort of dynasty taking place. I mean, a lot of the vineyards are owned by people for whom finding capital is not an issue.
Yeah, the governance is a really interesting point, going back to Chapel Down being majority owned by these minority shareholders from the equity crowdfunding they've done. And it's interesting to see their growth and obviously any constraints that comes with obviously having a share price to focus on too. Whereas you take the likes of the private owned big English commercial vineyards, like you mentioned, even looking at Denbies and Ridgeview and Raffiney, for example. It's completely different models. And do you see these big commercial vineyards taking very different approaches to their business strategy?
Well, I mean, Denbies is owned by a family. Chris White, he runs it. He's run it for a long while now. His father, you know, was the initial person behind it. I don't know what their family structure is. I don't know whether Chris has got children who want to take over or a brother or something, you know, that. But I see that as a family estate that they probably will stay in the family. But others, as I say, you know, if you own it and you don't want to give it up, you have to pass it on to somebody who's going to look after it. And not everybody has children who want to get involved. I mean, you know, my son is 50 this year. He's a bit like the king, you know, he's been waiting a long time for it to take over from me. So you know, many of the owners have made money in other businesses, so they don't start out as 20-year-olds. You know, they start out as 50-year-olds or 60-year-olds, and their children have already built their careers or are building their careers, and they don't want to play second fiddle to their parents running a vineyard. I mean, you know, Ridgeview, for instance, is completely opposite. You know, Mike died quite young. I suppose I don't know the age, but I think he was only about 65, 70 maybe, so relatively young. But you know, the family took over. He's got a sister. You know, there's two children who took over, and I see that remaining in the family. And I don't see them. You know, they had outside investors. They had one big outside investor, which they bought back. So, you know, the successful vineyards, I think are you know, they're charted for the, you know, well looked after for the future.
What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the English vineyard industry as a whole going forward?
Well, obviously, long-term financial sustainability. You know, it's the first leg of sustainability. Without it, you haven't got a business, and that comes from producing the right volumes of wine off the hectare, at the right quality, and being able to sell it. And that's, you know, a multifactorial equation, and it's no straight the right way, wrong way. And you know, a lot of people are making, you know, great wines, can't always sell them at the right price. A lot of people are making not so great wines, but happen to be able to sell them. But that's the wine world.
So does it go back to this idea of marketing and selling of the wine itself?
I don't know. When you look worldwide, a lot of people start out by producing a great wine and they're just waiting for people to come and buy it. And it seems to work. You know, people will you know, find out where the good wines are being made. And there's a big, you know, I mean, the wine industry has a huge amount of publicity, and the word travels very, very quickly. I mean, publicity-wise and, you know, PR-wise, I mean, how many, you know, newspapers, magazines, TV and radio stations have something about wine in them? I would say, you know, the vast majority. About bread or milk or cheese or, no, nothing, you know. It's a subject which fascinates, you know, a lot of people. And, you know, so as I say, if you produce good wine, the world will come knocking on your door. I mean, okay, it doesn't always work like that. And you have to be receptive, and you have to have facilities, and you have to be, you know, the right price. But all those things you find out in time. And it is something which you can't produce. You know, you can go to a wine merchant or a supermarket and say, look, I've just planted my vineyard. It's planted with this. We're going to produce that. would you be interested in interested in selling it? And they'll say, well, yeah, when the wine's ready, bring me a sample. Well, and it's got to be labelled and it's got to be ready to rock, ready to sell. So it's not like a lot of things where you can show a sample, and then you say, well, right, we'll make 1 million of those next year for you. So it's a commodity that's a commodity, but it's not a commodity because it lasts in the bottle. It's not like any other fresh fruit or vegetables. It has a shelf life. It also, in many cases, gets better as it gets older, which is not the case with most agricultural products. There are a few, so it has a sort of unique place in the world of consumables, of food and beverage, which is why it's sort of it's a fascinating, and there's no right way of doing it. That's the other thing. There's no right blend. There's no. If you look at a lot of crops, apples, there's half a dozen top varieties, and that's it. With wine, there's hundreds of them, hundreds of top varieties. Signature wines in one place and nothing in another. I think, we're talking about why has English wine sort of turned a corner in perception. And I think it's having, when you look at, I happen to have marked a dissertation on signature variety for the Okanagan Valley, Cabernet Franc. Is this going to be a signature variety for the Okanagan Valley? Well, when you've worked out where the Okanagan Valley is, and when you've worked out whether you've ever tasted a Cabernet Franc, whether you liked it, our signature variety or varieties are, Pinot, Chardonnay, and Bacchus from England. Now, anybody in the world of wine will know in those few words what's happening here. But Cabernet Franc from the Okanagan Valley, that's a bit of a stretch.
And you say what's happening here, I'm referring to the climate, and my next question is, where does climate change fit into the English wine industry?
Well, I don't think it's going to get cooler, not for the next 50 years, maybe not for the next 150 years. We are where we are. I don't think it's a downside at all. I see no real variation in. People say, well, it's a lot different than it used to be. We're getting far more abnormalities. Yeah, we're getting storms here and hail there, and we're a maritime climate. We're slightly softened by that maritime climate. The Gulf Stream and the polar ice and all that sort of thing. That is a factor which may or may not impinge on us over the next few decades. But most varieties can cope with quite a lot of variability. One of the things about sparkling wine, of course, is you can make decent wine from much less ripe varieties, less ripe grapes. But I see climate change, as well. It's been beneficial, and I see no reason why it shouldn't carry on being beneficial. I think the acreage will keep rising.
I was pleasantly surprised when I first heard that a Sauvignon Blanc in the Cotswold won a World Wine Awards not too long ago.
Pity the wine wasn't much better. It was not very good.
Do you think we're going to see more of these alternative grape varietals away from the traditional Champenoise grapes? No. Is that something that people like to sort of bang on about without there really being much substance to it?
It's banging on about it, yeah. Okay. No, Sauvignon Blanc, if you've got a great site, I guess you might get ripe grapes 2 out of 5. I don't know. But
okay.
Riesling is a no-no. People have tried it. Chenin Blanc, nobody's ever tried it. Yeah, there's people trying all kinds of weird and wonderful varietals. But in terms of the core, we are stuck with the 4 major varietals. Bacchus, I'll be around. Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. Meunier is probably now bigger than Bacchus. And then there's 2 sort of runners-up, Reistersteiner and Sèvres Blanc. I think the Charmat method, looking for quick ripening blends, is quick aging blends, as it were. We see a bit more Sèvres and a bit more Reistersteiner being planted. Not very much, but the major growers are all putting in Pinot and Chardonnay. Pinot in all its different variants, including Blauer Burgundy, Pinot Noir Précoce, and obviously the 3 major Champagne varieties. I don't see much Arbane or Petit Meslier or Pinot. Well, there's a bit of Pinot Gris going in as a sort of, if you've got got a tasting room, I think Pinot Gris is quite an interesting variety. Much better than Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc it's too acidic. Auxerrois is too acidic, although people are trying it. Albarino, people are trying that's far too acidic, but people are trying it. Blended with Bacchus, sometimes it's all right. in a good site. I mean, they're very site specific. And of course, you don't, when you're facing an untried site, it takes quite a bit of guts to actually say, right, we're going to plant this with X, Y, and Z, none of which have ever been tried in the UK before, because you make the mistakes way before you plant. And once you've made those mistakes on site, on clone and variety clone, rootstock, spacing, trellising, all those things, they're all made, not years, but months before you plant. And once you're planted, once you bought your vines and planted them, there's very little you can do but stand by your decisions. And so people say, well, and when you look at most other wine growing regions, they have, signature varieties. Pretty well every grape growing region has a signature variety. And they probably, on the 80-20 rule, they are probably 80% of all production. And the 20% is comprised of other varieties, suitable varieties that people can sell because they've made a name for themselves, or they've got good cellar door, or they're varieties that have done well elsewhere. I mean, Sauvignon Blanc would be nice. I mean, if we could replace all the backers with Sauvignon Blanc and get the sort of results that Marlborough is getting, but we can't. We can't. The acid is just too high. Unripeness levels are just crazy.
And we talk about these decisions of which grapes to pick, the viticultural practices as well. From a technology standpoint, now we hear a lot about AI, artificial intelligence, as a buzzword. But what role do you think these new technological advancements will play in the viticulture and winemaking world?
When you say technological advances, in what respect?
In one respect of the machinery and the equipment and the data side, and on the second hand, if at all, has artificial intelligence actually infiltrated the wine industry yet?
I wouldn't say so. No, I wouldn't know. Well, apart from writing answers to questions or tasting notes, probably. I mean, I don't. The world of wine moves very, very slowly. The world of viticulture moves pretty slowly. It takes generational change for sort of big things to happen. And if you've got your vineyard set up for 2 meters and geo pruning, you can't suddenly one day say, right, we're going to have wider rows and different pruning and different varieties. Because you have to have double machinery up. You have to sort of think about that. So once people have made a decision, which is why most regions have a standard way of growing. Not all, but most have a standard way of growing. All the machinery fits down that width of row. I mean, we're seeing a bit more few more self-driving or self-centering tractors. There's a bit more technology in spraying. Obviously, weather stations now are sort of cheap enough for most people to have one, but they don't always use them as they should be in terms of spraying. Spraying is one of these contentious areas which people like to say, "Oh, we don't do too much of it, blah blah blah." But it's like house insurance. You wake up on January the 1st and you insure your house. You don't wait till you see smoke and flames coming out the roof, to insure it. So spraying against diseases, if you want to get good crops for this year and next year and the year after, and you need to make sure your wood is and your foliage is well cared for.
We mentioned spraying. Is it a disadvantage, particularly in the likes of the UK, where there's more fungal diseases as a risk to the grapes growing? Do you think it's a disadvantage for organic and biodynamic growers here?
Well, it is, yeah, because it's damper. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And does that affect the quality of the grapes themselves or the yields or both?
Well, it affects the yields. I mean, I reckon the average yield for most organic and biodynamic vineyards is about 50% of a conventional. Mm. I don't think the quality is any better. I mean, how do you tell? But I mean, there's a lot of organic growers and biodynamic growers who have to start picking a little bit early in case disease gets in. It's a way of life. It's something you believe in and want to do. Fine, but I don't personally think it's a way to create a financially sustainable vineyard. Mm-hmm.
And have you been surprised by any other consumer trends? You mentioned natural wines earlier, in the likes of, for example, Pet Nat. Has anything surprised you over recent years?
Well, I can't say I have not liked most natural wines and Pet Nats I've tasted, so I don't hunt them out. But it's a fad. I mean, it is a bit like I'm well known in my family for buying things, fruit and vegetables, and letting them age. Pears particularly, lining my pears up on the shelf of the dresser and saying, right, nobody's going to touch those, please. I'm waiting for them to ripen. I think with natural wine, it's a bit like, you go into a supermarket, you buy some tomatoes, you put them in a bowl, and you allow them to spend a week, 2 weeks maybe, ripening up before you eat them. And they're so much better for that. And so I think, and with cheese and with other fresh produce, we all know that it has a curve, where it's unripe and then it gets ripe, and then after that it goes down and eventually it's uneatable. And I think, if you're going to make fresh natural wine like that has a curve of age curve, where it starts out slightly undrinkable and gets more drinkable and then goes down the other side, I think that's fine. But I think the public needs to understand that before they start buying it, and sommeliers need to understand that before they start serving it. I think most natural wines are probably good for a day or two. Before that, they're not. Before that, they're not so good, and after that, they're definitely not so good.
I'll take away from that.
But it's it's something that might develop. In terms of volume, I don't suppose it's really very much. So.
And as an expert in the space and also a spokesperson for the English wine industry, I'd love to get your take, and as I'm sure the English wine community would as well, on this duty revamp, and that's taken effect as of the 1st of August, which I think for wines between 11.5% and 14.5% ABV will incur something along the lines of a 20% increase in duty paid. What's your take on this?
Well, you have to remember that sparkling wine is going to be the same as still wine. So and considering that 70% of our production is sparkling wine, that will be less. But I'm not buying and selling wine. I don't get involved with commerce on that side. I was for 20 odd years. So I know enough about the duty. I think it's an inevitability. I think it's well, they seem to have gone about it in one of the most complicated ways imaginable. But I think people will get used to it. It's a change. Most people's wines from year to year don't vary very much, and you have to work out how much the duty is on each different wine you're selling. But if you're when you've got a stock book or a computer program with your stock in it, Excel, you've got every wine has a total, and you're selling it off that total. At the end of the month, you know how many bottles of that particular wine you've sold. Just a question of multiplying by the right figure and working out the duty. I guess, I don't think it's going to break a business. And I think it will drive people to make lower alcohol wines, which arguably is a good thing, except, of course, the increases in ripeness have made our wines that much better. And that is a slight problem. But I think we don't make 13% wines. By and large, most of it's between, still quite a bit of chaptalization goes on. So, there's plenty of people making wines at 10, 11, 12 maximum. I think I would say most English still and sparkling wine is probably under 12.5. But, it is what it is, and it's all the wines being treated the same. And in my experience, alcohol is one of the last things people want to give up. So.
Yeah. And that gets me thinking about Brexit as well. And I was at the WineGB Industry Conference earlier this year, and Jancis Robinson, in her opening keynote speech, mentioned that one potential advantage of Brexit is this shift towards buying local and towards this sort of innate sense of consumer patriotism to English wine. Do you see that as working in our favour, and to what extent does that play an important buying factor of local consumers of English wine?
I'm not sure it's Brexit. I think it's just people being careful about food miles, wanting to know where their product has come from. The horse meat scandal, all the scandals that we've been through, they were nothing to do with Brexit. I think there's been a genuine emphasis from British supermarkets to try and buy as many things as they can from Britain. And the ones they do buy from Britain, they shout about it. So to that extent, I think that helps English wines. And the fact that we are now being distributed, because there's more supply, we are being distributed and stocked by many more supermarkets and places where people will see wines. Plus, the on-trade has got many more English wines on their lists. So I think, I don't think it's particularly a Brexit thing, but I think it is a consumer, it's something that consumers are looking for is more local product.
Sure, and one adverse condition of Brexit has certainly been the labour shortage we've seen.
Yeah.
That surprised me, not just in terms of the picking, but also in the likes of sommeliers, which was pretty shocking. Have you seen that as well?
Well, labour, I wouldn't say, some people seem to be short of labour. And picking-wise, most picking, of course, of grapes takes place well after all the fruit's been picked. So apples and pears and other top fruits all been harvested pretty much by the time we start picking grapes. Most people seem to be working their way around it. I mean, I don't know of anybody that's... I mean, 18 was quite tricky because the crop was so huge. But I don't know anybody that's actually not picked grapes because they couldn't get the labour. And we've now got machines coming in. There's a couple of domestic machines. There may be one more as well this year. But then we've got machines coming over from Germany and France because, we're obviously later than their harvest. So their machines are sitting around not doing anything. I think we'll survive.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure we will survive.
And I'm definitely seeing more and more people considering things like the WSET. I just took my level 3, passed the tasting distinction, but unfortunately tried to cram the theory to no success, so I'll be retaking that. But going back to your time studying for wine, and for listeners who are considering enrolling in, whether it's the Master of the Wine down the line or they're studying for that, whether it's their first WSET diploma or their program, what advice would you give to people considering a career in wine and also studying for one of these courses?
Oh, that's a difficult one. You've got to do a lot of reading. Ideally, you want to do a lot of vineyard visiting, winery visiting, get a feel for actually what happens in vineyards and wineries. Short of that, I can't really give many. I mean, I started my started taking my wine exams quite late in my career. I mean, I've been growing grapes for 20 years before I started the Master of Wine. And I found the tasting side very difficult. Obviously, if you're in retail or in hospitality, you've got more chance of doing the tasting, but not so much chance of actually working in the vineyard and winery. But I get as much practical experience as you can. Certainly for Master of Wine, where you need to be obviously a layer above diploma.
We are seeing more internships. I think it was Hattingley who introduced one of the first industry internships working in the likes of a vineyard, and now I think it's Vinescapes have introduced a graduate program as well. So we're seeing more of these initiatives rolling out across the industry. Yeah,
there's some apprenticeship schemes. I mean, but they're really for people who want to stay in the English wine industry, I think, aren't they?
Yes.
People who've done perhaps Plumpton and looking for jobs. But I don't know what I'm not. That's not my area of expertise. I don't employ anybody. I don't have a winery or a vineyard, so I'm not really up to speed with those things. But I think as the industry grows, we need more people. We need more vineyard managers. We need more winemakers. We need people who are expert in marketing. So the industry is expanding.
And do you think it will always stay in the southeast as that majority hub of English viticulture?
Well, yes, because the climate's the best. Yeah, I mean, 75% of all vineyards are in the three, southeast counties: Kent, East, and West Sussex. A bit in Surrey, a bit more in Hampshire, but not in terms of volume. Mm-hmm. If you take, Hampshire and all the counties to the east, including Essex, I mean, that's like 85% of the industry.
Right.
And I was reminded that when I moved to Kent, Bodiam, the village of Bodiam, which is where Guinness were based, they had 6,000 acres of hops. 2,500 hectares of hops. There's very, very few there now. But it would be my guess that most of those hop fields you could plant with vines.
Wow.
And so, there's lots of land there. I mean, we used to grow a lot of Cox's apples. Most of those are gone now in the southeast. It's just not profitable. And I drive around Kent. I see a lot of land that could be planted.
Have you tried any of the wines from the likes of Yorkshire, for example, anywhere further?
Oh yes, no. Before I forget which book it was. I think it was the first edition of Wine Growing in Great Britain, I suppose. Before I sort of wrote disparaging remarks about vineyards in the north, I thought I'd better go and do a bit of a tour. So we went to Derbyshire and Yorkshire, all the ridings of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire. And I think we visited about 12 vineyards and tasted, most of what was on offer. I wasn't that, it was slightly better than I thought it was going to be.
Okay.
But in terms of quality, you're struggling.
You're quite narrow in what you can and can't produce in the first place.
Well, the trouble is, you can try Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Meunier. You can try sort of, climate varieties that need a slightly warmer climate, and you can make something out of them in sparkling particularly. but you can tell that they're not, they're not the ripest grapes in the world.
So what are your predictions for the English wine industry going forward? Not just from obviously, we talked about the main hub staying in the southeast, we've talked about production growing. Do you see any other trends that we haven't talked about yet?
I don't think so, no. I think, I think English sparkling wine, and to a certain extent Welsh sparkling wine, but I think English sparkling wine is going to go from strength to strength, find a much bigger market on restaurants and hotels and on-trade lists, find a market, for people wanting to celebrate this, that, and the other. And I think champagne will take a hit on that, on it. Champagne is always going to sell, obviously, but we're on about, depending on how you look at the figures, I think last year's 22 sales was around 8 million. I think that's the figure of all wines, all English and Welsh wines, of which probably 5.5 million is sparkling. I can see that doubling over the next few years, over the next 5 years, easily. It's going to have to as well because we're producing a lot more.
Yeah.
This year, it could arguably certainly be 15 million bottles. I think maybe nearer 18, 20.
So that would be a record beyond the 2018.
In terms of volume. Yeah.
Wow.
18 is still the biggest. 13.2, I think it was.
Okay.
Something like that, just over 13.
Understood. And also
about 46 hectolitres per hectare.
Okay.
Which is the next nearest on that is like 35, I think. So
what's your take on the recent revisions and the resubmission of the IGP/PDO proposal by, I think WineGB instigated this, a bit of a step change in what that entails, and also we've had the likes of Sussex being granted their own PDO. What's your take on all of this?
Well, it wasn't. So when we left Europe, it was always known that we were going to take all the regulations that we had from Europe and they were going to be taken into UK legislation. DEFRA then said, we're going to do that, but over the next few years, we want to have a consultation with you and we want to get your ideas of what you'd like to see, and then we'll have a negotiation and we'll change the law. So that's what's happening at the moment. So both PDO and PGI are being debated. We've had industry sort of surveys and so forth. But it'll take a little while before that fleshes out and comes to be. But I don't see anything that's real too contentious. There's this question of whether Saval should be in sparkling wine or not. That's fairly minor. I think it will get in there.
So nothing too controversial in any of this?
Well, I don't think so, no. Especially now that Champagne's allowed Voltis in there, with 5%. We got a bit of Saval in ours, they got a bit of Voltis. What's the difference? Still going to be Champagne, still going to be English sparkling wine. The PGO, PDI, I think we should just have one, personally. I don't see why we need two. We don't have the concept of table wine in our heads. We don't sell into intervention. That's the only reason that the French, or not the French, but by Europe, because wine is still a price-supported product. Has been always. There's no, as far as I can tell, there's no reason to change it. There's no moves to change it. So if at the end of the day, there's compulsory distillation, there's voluntary distillation. Europe consistently takes wine off the market to compulsory distillate based upon alcohol level. That's why you have a table wines regime, regional wine scheme. What do they call it? IGP, is it? No. It's an enhanced table wine, and they have a quality wine scheme. We don't need that. We've never bought wine. I think somebody might have sold some wine into intervention once, because there's a story of Prince Charles running his Aston Martin on English wine. But by and large, nobody has ever sold English wine into intervention, so we don't have that to worry about. So why don't we just have a quality wine scheme, one quality wine scheme, which accounts for the broad, the varieties. We can either restrict them or we can say plumb what you want, but there'll be a tasting, an analytical, a testing and a tasting procedure, as we have done for the last 33 years, or however long it is. It's 1990, I think it was. We sat on the committee. I sat on the committee. I was chair of it for a long while, trying to decide what we could do and what we couldn't do.
So it's the UKVA.
This is before that. It was English Vineyard Association. Yeah. I don't see why we just don't have one scheme that tests and tastes the wines, and they're given yes or given a no, and people take their chances, and if they're not in the scheme, they're out of it, and they have to can't sell their wine with a variety or a regional name or a vineyard name on it.
And should we be worried about what we're calling English sparkling wine? I think that's the default name it's been given.
No,
we shouldn't.
That debate's been put to bed a long time ago. Nobody wants it.
No one wants a sudden name change.
What's Meritage?
Asking the wrong person.
What's Satin? What's Topaque? There's three names. That Topaque is Australian sticky, Rutherglen Muscat. Can't call it that. It's now called Topaque. Satin is a dry-ish, up to 5 bar Franciacorta white sparkling wine. Meritage is a Californian Bordeaux blend. What's Cava ever done for the price and quality and prestige of Spanish sparkling wine? Prosecco, okay, it doesn't exactly exude quality, but it's made-up names by and large don't do anything for the product they're trying to promote.
And it tends to be called, for example, a Chapel Down or a Knighton, but more than anything else.
Oh,
anyway.
Yeah, but it's like a Moët Chandon or something. People don't say, they say, I'll have a glass of champagne, and the barman will say, well, yes, we've got Taittinger or so and so. I mean, champagne is like a bit like Prosecco. is unique in that it's a variety. It's a place name, which for generations and centuries, in the case of champagne, has been used as a sort of general descriptor. We don't have that, and I don't think making up a name is going to help at all. We don't need it. I mean, who worries about Californian sparkling wine or South African sparkling wine? Or they've got Cap Classique, haven't they? Which nobody outside South Africa knows anything about. New Zealand sparkling wine. I mean, there's plenty of that sold. Well, not plenty, but it is sold. So I don't think that'll ever happen. I know it won't.
Are there any major factors we should be concerned about in the next few years in the English wine industry? Something that's really concerning you that you're seeing at the moment?
Well, as a 75-year-old consultant, I'm not too worried about things in the future these days. Not so worried. No, I mean, I think there will be a reckoning at some stage. With how I had a conversation last night with somebody who is in the business. When we were saying, well, how long can it go on for like this? Is planting and more planting, and I think we are. The news that Rathfinny might be on the market. The news that, well, you confirmed that they've said they were looking for investors. But I think an investor would look at their books and would perhaps think, well, maybe not. I think we're going to see quite a bit of some changes. I think. Are
you excited to see the change?
Well, there will be some people who'll come along and think, well, we can do better than they've done. We can look after it better, or we can do this or do that, or we've got bigger pockets, or we'll plant elsewhere as well. So there's a lot of development, but the basics of if you're thinking of buying a vineyard, what are you looking at? You're looking at the yields and the quality. Mm-hmm. Those two things really are your guiding lights. And if you're not getting the right yield, is there a reason? If there isn't really a reason, or if the reason is location, there's not much you can do about that. And that really is bound up with the quality. The quality can only come from the site at the end of the day. And if the site is not really ripening your vines well enough to make the sort of wine, the quality wine that you want, then you might think twice about investing in that. I can think of plenty of vineyards that would be attractive to buy, but whether they're actually for sale or not is another matter. I think that's the problem. I think finding investors who want to invest in English wine is relatively easy. Finding something for them to invest in is very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Which is ironic, given actually the number of small listings of small-scale vineyards increasing, but like you mentioned earlier, the big commercial vineyards not necessarily looking to exit themselves, so there's almost a supply and demand
It will
gap.
happen, of course. We had Bolney, which wasn't the greatest vineyard in the world, to be honest, but Freixenet wanted to get into that for some reason, but Freixenet are a very strange company, and we'll see. I think Jackson Family Estates is a much more interesting proposition. with their background and the way they, I mean, as I understand it, the way, I was not understand it, I was told, their normal way of working is to go to approach a successful existing vineyard and winery and say, right, we would like to buy 50% of you. We want you to stay on. We want you to run the vineyards and make the wine. We will take over the marketing, and we will do 50-50. And so neither has control, and we will help you with our technical side, our finance side. We will look after all the marketing, invoicing, and all that sort of thing. And I think that's, for a lot of people, that's quite attractive, because that's the difficult part, getting it work distributed worldwide. But with their distribution, they've got, and all their acres they've got, they can plug you into their sustainability advisors and their winery design people, and
There's something to be said about that.
And you get 50% of the capital up front, and you still own 50% of the vineyard.
Yeah, it's an investor-operator model. It's this idea, for example, if, like we see in finance, when people buy wind farms, they're not expected to go and run the wind farm themselves and know anything about the turbines. So you hire an operator. You hire someone like a Vinescapes who know their stuff, experts, technical consultants do a lot. You hire a vineyard management team, and like you said, if you have the specialization of back office, marketing, sales, you tap into that, and ultimately you roll that across all of your brands or subsidiaries. I think that's a lot what's happening in the likes of US and in Napa, but in the UK I think it's still so much family estates and home-owned operations that they're trying to do too much at once. And
I think Jackson's are having to operate slightly different in the UK because they haven't found somewhere they could buy yet. We wait to see. They're not frightened of investing, that's for certain.
And do you think Crouch Ridge is Crouch Ridge Valley where they're going to?
Well, the Crouch Valley.
Crouch Valley.
Well, that's where they bought 60 acres, I understand. It's still, I think it's still going through the sales, but they're paying a lot of money for it, I know that much.
So it's not the last we might hear from Jackson Family Wines.
I don't think so, no.
It might pave the way.
I think the Gusbourne tie-up there might be something in that. I mean, Michael Ashcroft's, he's 2 years older than me. We were at college together in Chelmsford. He was doing an accountancy degree. But so I know him. So the college we were at is now called Anglia Ruskin, and it was called the Mid Essex Technical College of the School of Art. And he and I were there at the same time. So I was made an honorary doctor and he's the vice chancellor. Mm-hmm. So at my induction, and we've had dinners and so forth, I went up to him at one of the dinners and introduced myself and said, you won't remember me. I said, but I was at college with you, and we talked about that for a little bit. And I said, and I gather you're interested in English wine. He said yes, and he was rather. He said I just bought one. And I thought, oh, really? He said yes. He said it's Gusbourne. I thought, well, that's interesting. And a few days later, it was announced.
Wow. Yeah. This was right before he had bought the site itself and established.
Well, he was just going. I don't know the mechanics, but he was a little bit indiscreet, I think. He was very keen to let me know.
Just excited.
I think he'd obviously heard my name, I guess, and worked out who I was. No, I mean, but he's, as I say, his son is involved in Belize with property. I mean, he had a nephew who was involved with the winery at one stage. I met him a couple of times, but I don't think he's around anymore. He owns 70-something% of it, or thereabouts. I forget now. I think Andrew Weaver still owns a little bit, but it needs someone to take that on to the next stage, really. Yeah. And I think they're ready to do that. They've got more land to plant. They've just bought more land, which was bought from Andrew Weaver's wife, which is right next door. They've got that to plant, and I know they're looking at other sites. And I think they've got a great name. They're producing some good wines, and Charlie will leave, but they got people in the wings to take over.
Yeah, fantastic wine. I tried their Blanc de Noir, and I think it was the Kent County Wine Show last year, and it was just phenomenal. Yeah. So they're in good hands.
I took some investors around. We went to Chapel Down, Gusbourne, Harrow and Hope, and Squerries. Yeah, and we tasted quite a few wines at Gusbourne, including the late disgorged 15, I think it was. Brilliant wine. And they got this, what's the top one called? 51, I think it's called. Mm. Yeah, very nice.
It's very premium range of wines too. That they're in.
Yeah. And I think they seem to be set for the future. So we wait to see.
It's a very exciting time in general for the English vineyard industry.
I think so, yeah. And there's a lot of investors who are keen to try and get involved, and things will come up for sale, and land will come on the market, and the price of land, is quite attractive now, I would say, to farmers wanting to raise a few bob. If they've got the right land that's the right type, and shape, and altitude, and elevation, and accessible. There's certainly plenty of people looking for it, that's for certain.
And as we wrap up this podcast, I really been meaning to ask you, what are your next steps? You mentioned that you'd like to go back and update your book. Is there any other plans for you?
No, not really. No, I keep playing a bit of bridge, and I'm enjoying my writing and consulting and helping people with their vineyards. Got another raft of projects coming on for next year. One big one up in Suffolk, a couple of small ones down in southeast. People planting a bit more. It's like same as normal. So
business as usual.
Yeah, business as usual. Very much so. Yeah.
Well, you've been very generous for your time. I really appreciate the discussion.
Good to talk to you.
And thanks again, and all the best with your current projects. And I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks very much.